Welcome to Hope Springs Eternal. I'm back. It's Jay Jackson here with
Ricky Ricks.
Katie Lammert.
We're here to talk about what we believe as United Methodist Christians in our deep belief that through the United Methodist Church, hope springs eternal. Today's topic is humankind in the best sense of who we were made to be, with sacred worth and with a belief that the very image of God is implanted on us. I guess that's all we have to say about the good aspects of human nature. But that's what we're going to be covering today as we talk. Ricky, where do you see humans at their best?
Well, I think that when we read the original creation story, or one of the original creation stories, it begins for me when God says, looked upon us and said they're very good, and it describes us as people that are made in the image of God. And I guess that's the real starting point for me. And then to live that out, to claim it, to see it in the people around us, and to know that we are all inherently, without doing anything, we are people of sacred worth. Okay. How about you, Katie?
Yeah, I agree with that. That I think to claim what God says about us in the beginning, that we are made in God's image, that we are good and very good, and that is what we were made into, what we were born into. And I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, but just that sort of confronts some other scriptures and maybe other beliefs about ourselves, that we were conceived in sin and those kind of things. And I think, of course, that's there. But, I think of just when we look out on people and when people are pressed, we see the goodness of people. And I think that's something that we all probably ought to do a better job of affirming and seeing and dignifying in others and in ourselves, is just seeing that we are perfect, that God made us and made us good, and just affirming that we are His image bearers, and what a good thing that is.
Yeah, I think that especially when we go through challenging times, when we find ourselves maybe not where human beings are at their best, we kind of almost begin the story in Genesis 3 with the fall. And that we get so caught up in the brokenness of humanity that we forget about the initial intention of God, a God that we profess is a good God, a loving God, a gracious God, and that with intentionality has created human beings to be in relationship with God, with a divine spark, an image that reflects God, and that when we see the tarnishing of that, the brokenness of humanity, when we see ourselves at our worst, that sometimes we can lose a sense of that. And that's understandable. But if we cannot affirm that human beings have a special place in God's heart, with a desire for God to have us be participants in what God is doing, to know that God reflects upon us not only as very good, but the very hope for how we can be, partners in implementing the course of the divine purpose in all of creation, then it could be a very pessimistic and dismal story of humanity. I like to be an optimist when it comes to humanity. It's what keeps me getting up every morning and continuing this journey with God. It's the hope that I have for myself and others through that divine spark that's there.
And to me, it's not a matter of some naive optimism about ourselves or humanity or community. I think there is a realism to that, that sees that. Well, I've been reading this book by Donna Hicks. I reread it because it's really a good teaching thing for me right now. And she talks about it in terms of viewing ourselves and the people around us, and in fact, community and creation, in terms of dignity, and that to see sacred worth in all those things, and that's the way that we are created. And she talks about neuroscience and some things like that, where they've identified neurons and things that line up that way. And so I think that when we talk about this, it's not just some sort of naive, oh, wouldn't that be nice? But there's a real practical sense of this, and we need to claim it. When we need to claim it when we deal with ourselves. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I'm the one that I have the most problems seeing sacred worth, but we need to claim it about the people, especially when Jesus would say, "Love your enemies." I mean, the people that annoy the heck out of us, to see sacred worth in them, and then to see our community and creation in those same terms. I think that's a valuable way to go through life.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I don't want to be a Pollyanna in any kind of sense that doesn't have a sense of the need for God's grace.
Absolutely.
In my life and in the human beings that God has created for a better purpose than oftentimes we embrace for ourselves. But if I also deny that sense of goodness in humanity, it's overwhelming. And one would begin to wonder, why would God invest so much energy and time in what seems like a wasted effort on humanity if we're going to look at it in the most pessimistic, negative sort of sense? So I think it's really especially important at a time where there's so much shaming that goes on in our world. Body shaming, behavioral shaming, judgment from afar, expectations, energy wasted on facades that don't indicate authentic human goodness, that we should really try to recapture a sense of the divine purpose in humanity and a hope that's there that we should see more than glimpses of. We hope to see in fullness through the power of God's grace at work in us, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that, like you said, there's something more than just optimism or naivety, but that there's some sort of faithful practice in choosing to, over and against the issues that we face of sin and damage in the world, to choose to view people in the Imago Dei, in ourselves and in others. That to do that is also to actively participate in choosing the Spirit and choosing to let that be the lens to which we view the world and humanity through. And that in doing that, we're actually agreeing with God, and we're agreeing with God over and against what the world might be trying to tell us. And I think that's reflected so often in scriptures when Jesus and others say, you never know. You never know when you give a cup of water to the least of these, it's like you're giving it to myself. Or when you entertain strangers and welcome them into your home, it might very well be that you're welcoming angels into your home. And I think all of these scriptures, and there's so many others, are alluding to the sense that there's so much more worth and dignity, and that we are so much more divine than we give ourselves and others credit for, and that as we practice the faithful imaging of God into other people, that we are actually transformed, that it transforms us, and it does transform the world. And it's not just positivity. It's not just, Ricky was joking before the podcast, this like kind of hippie, you are the trees and the moon and the stars. It's not just that, but it's a faithful, spirit-filled imaging of and agreeing with God about who people are and what's inside them. And I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his book, Life Together. He talks about, I can't see you except through the lens of Christ, that every time he looks at somebody, well, obviously we fail at this, but when he looks at others, he looks at them through Jesus, as though he's looking at them through this image of Christ and vice versa. And I think to do that, to actually choose to do that, to see the image of God in others, is a faithfulness and an obedience that we have to be called into, that most of us are just failing at a lot.
Well, something I wanted to grab onto that you said early on, and that was how you start to see the goodness of humanity in others. I think when we can find the goodness of humanity in another, it does translate into a way of us embracing that goodness within ourselves. Mm-hmm. That when it's done the other way, when we're in this sort of hyper-egoistic kind of mode of narcissistic, I want to be the best person that I can be, it's all about me, that it's really harder to become the person God wants you to be if you don't see yourself in relationship with others and see the goodness in others. Because the goodness in others, if we see them in that light, I think it brings out that goodness in us, that empathy, that commonality of human experience, that relational aspect that God desires from humanity with God. We need to live that out in our relationships with one another by seeing the good in other people, especially people who are different from us in some way, male and female, old and young, black and white, of different economic circumstance. When we can really see goodness in other people, and when we can bring that out, I think it helps us to be more aware of how we can be who God wants us to be.
Both of you know this, I'm struggling with that word good, because I think that gets defined in so many different ways. Mm-hmm. And I think that as I was sitting here listening, I was wondering, okay, what if I see a person and I keep looking and looking and looking, and I don't see anything that I would call good about that person? And what I'm wondering is if it goes even further than that, if there is just this trust or acceptance that maybe even when I don't see goodness, mm-hmm. That they are a person of sacred worth in the creation of God, and that I have to trust God about that's how God has created them. And so...
especially when we want that in how people look at us, right? I mean, I think we all want to be seen with the best, most hopeful perspective of mm-hmm. others. Mm-hmm. In fact, so often we do so many things to get the favor of one another, mm-hmm. to be seen and to be affirmed for who we are. And yet, if we're not willing to offer that to somebody else unconditionally, how can we expect to receive that for ourselves? It's that two-way kind of thing that needs to be there. Because let's all face it, there are times where I find it hard to find something good in me. How would somebody else do that? Sometimes some people have been very difficult in my life. I have difficulty with some of their behaviors and actions. And yet, if I can't see good in them, how am I going to mm-hmm. be faithful to the call of God to recognize the image of God that we each have in us? It's a challenging endeavor. Katie, does anybody come to mind when you think about the goodness of humanity? A person in your life, a person that speaks to you in a way through the way in which they've conducted their lives that just says, that person helps me to see the goodness of God in humanity.
I mean, there's a lot of people. The first people that come to my mind are my daughters. Lily is 6 right now, and I just want to say she's all good. There's not a mean bone in her body, and it's scary, honestly, to think about, because I just think of how easy it will be for her to be broken. Rosie's a little bit more of a gangster. Is that okay to say? She's just.
I wonder where she gets that at,
she's
Katie.
Just feisty. No, she's Michael. But she'll just walk up to you and hit you. But she's sassy. But yeah, I mean, both of them in their pureness and innocence and beauty and wonder, and that one of the worst fights Lily's ever gotten into was last year in her 4-year-old class about whether or not mermaids were real. And I just think, if only all of our fights were about if mermaids were real. And, y'all are like, of course, that's what your daughter is fighting about at school. The notes coming home, Lily is fighting with so-and-so in her class because he told her that mermaids were not real. And I'm going, it's okay.
Believe. Lily,
yeah.
Believe.
Stand up.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that these people that, is Lily perfect? Of course she's not. People are not dogs. We don't want them to be obedient. I don't want my children to be obedient, except sometimes when I'm really tired and wish they would listen. But something about their goodness is just them being authentically themselves. And so, I mean, I've quoted all these people before, but Mary Oliver is my favorite poet, I think, and just the way she looks at the world helps me see that the world is beautiful and good and worthy. And I don't think Mary Oliver considered herself a Christian when she died, but I think she's just full of good and lived a good life. Wendell Berry, I think, is a good person and helps me to see that the world, while broken and damaged, is good. And so I think these everyday saints, that are they doing anything extraordinary? I don't know. I think my daughters are doing extraordinary things, but to the world, probably not. But in showing, in adding goodness, I think definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I go immediately back to that little town that I grew up in Nutter Fort, West Virginia, and I think about Maudie Davis, who I shared a birthday with, probably 60 years apart, but we shared the same birthday. And Maudie was a woman who married later in life and whose husband died young, so she never had children of her own, but was like a mother, aunt, grandmother to every child in that community. And we would gather, I mean, a dozen kids would gather around her home, and you knew there were going to be blonde brownies and chicken in a basket, crackers and sociables, and always a warmth and a sweetness that just exude goodness. And when I think about the goodness of humanity, I think about someone like Maudie Davis, who I can never remember a time that she raised her voice, but always had a smile, a hug, and love for everybody she came encounter with. And she will never be known outside of Nutter Fort, West Virginia, except for where I share her name. But she was a heroine to the goodness of God in humanity because of the way in which she shared that love unconditionally with me and countless others. Yeah. I have a granddaughter, Maddie, that doesn't have a mean bone in her body. Even when her brothers tear up her artwork or do something that is just heinous, she just seems to just persevere and go on and still be the same sweet, kind, gentle-spirited girl that makes me smile even when I am frustrated and tired, and at the end of my rope, I see something in people that brings out the goodness again in me because I see it witnessed in their lives. It doesn't have to be Florence Nightingale or Mother Teresa or Billy Graham or whoever your larger-than-life heroes and heroines are. But sometimes it's just ordinary people who just reveal that goodness in a way that you want to be like that.
Yeah.
What about for you, Rick?
I think about, I'm the oldest one at this table, and I think about 40 some odd years of ministry and how those people showed up in my life and continued. I mean, I think about in Elysian Fields was my first church, and it was just full of saints. I mean, just full of saints. There was Lillian Esco, who played the piano on Sunday nights at church, and she was a terrible piano player. But Lillian brought this cake with her and set it on the piano every Sunday night. And I promise you that thing was so full of rum. And she would, after the worship service was over and people wanted the service to be over really quick, she would get it and serve right there in the sanctuary, serve up cake to everybody. And but that was her way. I mean, not just then. And then right across the street from her lived this guy. He was an oil field hand, and he didn't come to church. He said that the church would fall in if he came, but he went through that whole little town, changing light bulbs for widows, doing those kind of things. He loved reading Louis L'Amour books, and so he'd be sitting on his back porch, and I'd go over to see him or to see his mom, and James Lewis would he would yell out just loud enough for his mom to hear, "Preacher, you want a beer?" And his mom would from the house, "James Lewis, don't say that to the preacher." And just I just countless people like that who, in different ways, share the love of grace of God. And I was thinking about, when you were talking, both of you, how many times I've found myself going, when I grow up,
Yes,
I want to be, and it's not been the famous people that I've wanted to be. It's been the Lillians and James Lewises or Pink Holcomb or just, countless people across my life that have just, you looked at them. I mean, you could almost look in their eyes and you knew there was something of God about them. And I expect that's true for all of us. If we were to sit in a room with 20 people and say, "Can you name someone who showed God to you?" I mean, people wouldn't even flinch. They could just do it just like that.
And some of them with an ornery streak, with signs of the brokenness of maybe a penchant for a extra beer or smoking a cigarette or whatever it is that may be the flaw of their character. But there's something that exudes more deeply in their lives that reveals a sense of otherness, of care, of love to other people. I remember a fellow in the church I was growing up in who would just tease me constantly, but it was so welcomed because I knew he was teasing me because he noticed me where other people were too busy to even see that I was there. And I think that's part of the thing that's instilled in me, this teasing nature of people that I love. I tease them because, to me, teasing means you're seen and recognized, and that there's a ability to go past just niceties to draw out relationship with people. That really spoke to me, and I think I've maybe taken that to an extreme in my own life of being a little maybe at times with people who aren't so welcoming of that, teasing of people I love. But to me, that translates into that's a deeper kind of way of expression than just niceties.
Yeah. I think about people who have made space for me in community or in their lives, just to experience the presence of God.
Yeah.
And I think most of them have been broken people who know what that's like, and that's very real to them. And they don't want to solve it, but they want to give you a place for whatever's going on in your life. I take my mom to eat breakfast most every morning, and we go to this restaurant Jay and I have been to, and it's called Mama's, and on Fifth Street in Tyler, just a great place. And there was this waitress that was there for a while, and she would come over every morning, and she would say, she would hug Mama, and which here's my mom, 86 years old, and frailty and those kind of things are real issues in her life. And she'd say, "So what do y'all want?" And so we'd give our order, and she'd start laughing. I mean, every time she'd start laughing, and she would say, "Well, I'll take this to the kitchen, and we'll see what happens." But I like that when people have that spirit about them, that they're going to love on us, they're going to laugh with us and cry with us, and also they're not going to give. I mean, I think the real saints are not people that have answers, but they're the ones that say, "Well, in God's good grace, let's see what happens," and trust that something's going to come. And
I look back upon people who were really seriously flawed. I had a junior high coach, Arnett Rollins, who could curse like a sailor, who sometimes was not the most sensitive person to women, was old school and hard driving as a coach, but there was something that you always felt that he saw in you that maybe you didn't even see in yourself, that he would bring out in that. And when you had Coach Rollins on your side, you felt special. And that doesn't diminish some of the things that were flaws about his character, but I think when somebody sees something in you that you don't even see in yourself, there's something about the goodness of God in that, and that we need to be able to see in that person that is invisible to other people, or that person who people go to the other side of the street to avoid, or maybe doesn't speak of because they're taboo within that community. When one can see the humanity in others, the goodness of God comes through in their lives. I'll always remember Coach Rollins as somebody who was on my side, even when he was barking at me and sometimes cussing me up one side and down the other.
I'll brag on Katie yesterday. There was a lady that came to church, and she came in early, and she was getting some coffee and some donuts. And Katie remembered her name. I didn't. And she was... it was just amazing to watch the transformation on her face when we said her name. And she came over, and Katie asked if she wanted to pray with us. And I mean, you could just watch the smile rise on her face, even just for a little while, because we were saying there is something of you that we see worth, and you have a place here with us, and in all of that, I was just like, she was saying, "Good,
Yes,
good."
Yeah.
In you. We see that in you.
It comes out in us when we see it in others.
Yeah.
I think when we can see the best of who someone is, it initiates a desire to make that more real in the life of the person who is seen in that light, and in the light of the people who are seeing it in them. I know I'm a better person when I see the best in people, and I can be pretty negative and difficult when all I see is the difficulty and negativism in others.
Yeah.
It brings it out in me.
Sure.
I find that.
I've got a question for you, Katie. In Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, there is this part where it says God has put eternity in our hearts. And I was thinking about that last week, about what does it mean? So I'm asking you, what does it mean to talk about God putting this gift of eternity in our hearts?
He gives me the hard question, Jay.
I don't know what you did to him, but gosh.
Yeah.
He knows you have a better chance at answering that than I do.
Sometimes.
No, I want to hear Katie's answer.
I'll ask both of you the same question. What does that mean to you
Yeah.
that God's put eternity in our? I am by asking.
Yeah.
I do think
I'm gonna
that
give Katie first shot.
speaks. The wisest person ever said all of these random things in Ecclesiastes that none of us know and understand. But I think that it does pull us into our divine image, our divine nature, that there's something of this life, there's something of this world that is not final, is not the fullness, is not all the way yet. It's just a taste, it's just a glimpse of what we were created for and what we will experience finally. And so, I think that it's really important to have a view when we can, and we forget so often, but to know that I think He's put eternity in our hearts, to know that this is not it, that these things are just shells. They're just these temporary masks. As much as we try to be our authentic self and to truly bring all of us, even that will fade away. Talking about humanity, and we can talk about the goodness of humanity, but at the same time, our scripture is laced with the finiteness of humanity and the fact that we are chaff in the wind, and that we're grass that withers, and just the humility in admitting that at the end of the day, we're not God. And yet he's placed us just a little lower than angels, and we have this taste and this desire for eternity, for infinity in our hearts. And to me, it's a longing, it's a yearning, it's the sense that, and it's a hope of that there's something more, and that we'll experience that one day. And to me, that's the kind of the optimism and that belief in magic that I, for one, want to hold on to, that if people can knock and people can say is naive or whatever they want to say about it, but I always think I will hold fast to believing in mermaids or whatever the thing is, because I think if I believe in a God that became human in the womb of a virgin and then conquered death and the grave so that I would never have to die, and if I believe in life everlasting, if I believe in all of these huge, impossible things, and if I believe in eternity, and if I believe in heaven.
And by the way, she does.
And I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
You kept saying if, so I just wanted to make sure people know. You do.
Yeah. But if I believe in this stuff, believing in petty magic, it just doesn't seem like that big of a thing to believe in. And to me, the practice of belief, the practice of hoping against hope, the practice of keeping my mind and heart open to the best, to the magical, to fantastic things happening all around us, is like affirming what Solomon says, and that He's placed eternity in our hearts, and that there's something more on the horizon. And I at least want to live in a world where everything we know is not yet known.
Yeah. Well, when you were saying it to me, I agree with so much of what you're saying there, Katie. When I hear eternity in our hearts, it's that aspect of us finally being able to see as God sees us fully. We get to see God fully, to use a 1 Corinthians reference, and to know that as we've been fully known, the way God sees us through Jesus Christ. I mean, justifying grace is where God sees us as we can be, even when we're not yet there. And then we're working through God's sanctifying grace to become that. And I think eternity in our hearts is where that spark of the divine call to be more than what we often are, through the power of God's grace, is at work in us. And so those were the things that started immediately coming to light for me. I always think it's interesting about how people talk about eternal life as a future hope, and it's supposed to be a present reality, that even as we find ourselves in the brokenness of a world that is not what we believe it should be, and where we can easily become overwhelmed, the grace of God allows us to see it for what it still yet can be, and allows us to live as we ultimately desire to be, in the presence of God, as He's present with us now, not just in a time to come. So it's a beautiful thing to see eternity come into the present, in our reality and how we're dealing with it. And I know for me, that's when I start to see people as I hope God sees us. Mm-hmm. I'm still working on that, but when I even get glimpses of it, it lifts my spirit.
Well, and I think, and I remember in confirmation at a different church I was at, I asked the youth, if there were any people that they thought were definitely not in heaven or something like that, who would it surprise them to find out? And it's always the really big people that, the Adolf Hitlers and people like that they're like, they're definitely not in heaven. And it's always an interesting theological and thought question of, how would it confront you? Would you be mad to get to heaven and to find Adolf Hitler in heaven? Who would you be upset about if you got to heaven and found that person, even that person, whoever it is,
the last person you would want to see,
was in heaven?
C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce
Yes.
Postulates that encounter. What would it be like if the person who met you in heaven was the person you least wanted to meet there? That's an interesting. What if we were the last person someone wanted to meet there, because of somehow the way in which our lives have been detrimental to theirs?
Yeah, and I think just viewing people in light of God's grace and not, how we view them, we have that eternal view of people, and we have this original view from Genesis of people, this goodness, and it affects how we live now. When we have eternity in our hearts now, it should affect, like you were saying, Jay, it should affect our present, that we can no longer treat people as though it's, well, here and now I can treat you hostilely, and here and now I can treat you as an enemy, and here and now I can treat you with hate and contempt and rage and with violence. And for all eternity, that won't count, because eternity is now. And, anyways, I just think it's a really interesting thought.
Even the biblical witness of the faith and the tradition that has been born from this Christ movement still struggles with the not yet that is our reality. And I just know for myself, I become more easily who God wants me to be when I seek to see others for who they can be rather than who they are not.
in who they are.
Yes.
Already
Yes,
in the grace
exactly.
of God. Yeah.
And seeing that as a reality and treating them in that way, I find myself being led to be more the way God wants me to be. And when I'm not taking that pathway, when I'm judging them, when I am negating the goodness that is a part of the divine spark in their lives, I am not going to be the person God calls me to be in that. And so I'm trying to deal with the things that I have control over, which is how I embrace that and how I see people more and more. Some I have to work a little harder at that with, as they do with me.
You know, Saturday at Fall Fest, I ran into some friends of mine, and they go to a church that's not Methodist in any vein. And so we were talking, you know, hi, how are you, da-da-da-da. And she said, I'm really sad. And I said, what's their sadness? And she said, our church is split. And I said, you're kidding. And, you know, she gave some detail about it and everything. And then she said, I don't understand how we can look at each other this way. And you know, the pain they were feeling and the things that had shattered their church. And I was just sitting here thinking, I wish I'd given her the answer of we shouldn't. I mean, we shouldn't see each other that way, because that's not how God created us. You know, we're different people, and that's a rich and a beautiful thing. But at the heart is this common bond, created in the image of God. And when everything else falls apart, that still remains true. And in some ways, I mean, I know there are times of violence and abuse that separation becomes necessary. But most of life ought still be held together by that one bond, that we are children of God.
Yeah. It reminds me of something Bishop Huey used to say when I was on the cabinet, and she would talk about how it's amazing how we could raise money for needs when we were in a crisis of a hurricane relief or a major negative event, but that people were not nearly as generous when things were going well. Why is it that it takes a crisis for us to be generous? And in a way, why does it take a crisis for us to see the humanity in people who look different than us, who live different than us? You know, when they talk about saving somebody in a flood, they're not talking about their socioeconomic position or what person they voted for or what their bank account is. They just look at them and they're saying, there's a human life that's in danger. Let us be about that. And I think God sees that in us and sees the beauty of each life, maybe because we are in crisis at times. But what a sad thing it is when we lose that sense of the preciousness of a human life, the goodness that's found in it, and how that life can embrace that when encountering love, when encountering God and selfless love. There's been many a life that's been turned by that. My life has been turned by that kind of love.
Nice.
And I would love for us to be more intentional in the ordinary times about how we see that in others and maybe let it come alive in us anew. Now, next week, we're going to talk about that other side of the story, the brokenness of the human condition, that part that we probably are all too aware of. But I'm really thankful that we started off with a conversation today about the goodness that is a part of the human experience, this goodness that God has offered us in the sacred worth that we have in the image of God. And I hope that you'll join us next week when we talk about that, if you will, diminishment of that goodness that is the human condition.
Before we go, Jay, I'm always trying to be sensitive about this. When I was talking about sticking together, and that if you're in an abusive place, that's not God honoring to stay in that place. And if there is violence and things, that's in no way do I want anyone to hear that I'm saying that you need to stick that out.
Right.
What I'm saying is that there is something in the ordinariness of life where we rediscover being together is a good gift from God.
Sometimes in the midst of our pain is where we need to know the goodness of our lives, that they're worth rescue, they're worth relief from abusive situations.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that out, Ricky. We're glad that you joined us, and we hope that our time that we've spent with you has allowed hope to spring eternally anew in you. Till next week.
Bye-bye.